Alright everyone, since everyone persists in the delusion that I'm either on the left or on the right or something like that, it's time to dispel that rumor. I am simply pro-liberty, number one. I believe in free speech at all costs, number two. And number three, I have a message for people who, they're part of the sort of ideological echo chamber of the fringe right or left. They're like on the identitarian fringe, or they're a communist or something. I've got a question for you. If you think, as most people do, that your view of reality is correct, that it's objective, that it's backed up by evidence, that it makes sense, that it's more or less true to the exclusion of any ideological opponents you encounter, why wouldn't you want those people who you consider to be dumb or misled to speak freely? If you think they're dumb and misled, why would they be a threat to your views? Why would you think that their ideology would grow? Here's really the problem of the fringe. The fringe falls into an echo chamber often and starts attempting to suppress the other fringe that they identify as their ideological opponents, causing, of course, collateral damage with people that have nothing in common with those groups. I still get today, for example, people who proclaim themselves to be like socialists or communists. They think I apologize for fascism. I have people that are fascists, self-proclaimed, or national socialists. They think that I'm a far left or something like that. They lump me in with, because I'm not in full support of their proclaimed objective ideologies, they assume that I'm somewhere on the other side. And that's not the case. I'm not part of that struggle. For years and years now, I've argued for free speech. I don't argue in favor of identitarianism, and I don't argue in favor of communism. I'm largely antagonistic of both. My passive support for what the alt-right was doing during the election was prefaced on the fact that people at the time were primarily spewing frog memes. It had nothing to do with any greater love for white identitarianism. Just as my passive support of the left when the Iraq War was going on was because, well, they're arguing against the war. They're arguing against proxy conflict, and I support that. It's not because I proclaimed myself to be a socialist or something like that. People have this weird tendency to fall into these very fanatic echo chambers, and they assume that the whole world is against them, when really they're the agents of their own misfortune. Right now you have people on both the left and the right who are seeking to censor everybody that they disagree with, which is 99% of the population in both cases. And so you have small, angry groups of people that don't even realize that in the process of doing that, you're not really going to affect the establishment that you're supposedly fighting against. You can say, the communist says, well, even like these garden variety liberals, they're petit bourgeois and stuff like that, so they're abusive. They're part of that evil complex. Somebody on the right, the further right, like the identitarians, they look at even like mainline conservatives. They say, oh, this is a sellout. They're trying to destroy our nation. They sold out to globalism or some other group. And yet you're seeking to use those establishment sort of powers to abuse your ideological opponents without realizing you're attempting to seek refuge with your stated enemy. And you think that's a good idea. Well, bless you for being delusional, I suppose. It's not going to work. What we do need in this country, and this goes out to the left and right as well as everyone in between, what we need is free speech at all costs. If you think that a group of Nazis marching down the street is vile and wicked and evil, you should want them to march in the streets. You should want them to have that wickedness on full display, because if you believe at all in the nobility of the average human being and their general kind of intelligence, that they're capable of occasional rational thought, they're going to reject that message, aren't they? The same is true like when Antifa shows up. Well, you don't want to censor them. You don't want to keep them from speaking. You want them to speak. You want them to show up and throw rocks and stuff because they make themselves look like idiots. That's the whole point. It's like the establishment itself with its neoliberalism, neoconservatism, its general, half-assed interventionism, pro-corporate, pro-war sort of bullshit rhetoric. I want them to speak. I love it when the legacy media says stupid things. I don't have a problem with that. I actually like it. I wouldn't want them to be kicked offline either, because I'm convinced that the average person will take one look at their swill, realize it's propaganda, and it's full of crap. And look, arguing in favor of liberty is always a good thing. regardless of your ideology. Like if you're a communist, there was a time not that long ago when the U.S. government itself was like, oh yeah, we'll just censor these communists. Oh, we'll suppress this booklet, and we'll break up this movement, and we'll do this, that, and the other. We'll ramble against them on TV through some state media. Go on NPR and talk about how evil they are. And that wasn't that long ago. And the same is true of people who are like, they're total Nazis or something like that. They're used to having that happen. Well, wouldn't you just want to speak freely and supposedly, according to you, within your echo chambers, I see you both making this claim all the time, you're saying, well, we're objectively right. The communist says, I'm objectively right. The bourgeois are abusive. The corporations are abusive. Capitalism is evil. So why would you want to give what you consider to be an abusive bourgeois capitalist state? It's not capitalism, but you make that claim. Why would you want to give it the power of censorship or something like, or the corporations that it's in bed with? You want to give them the power instead. So you have people, they're communists, they're collectivists, and they want to give multinational corporations the ability to censor things. Doesn't that seem like a weird idea for people who are communalists? What about for people who are nationalistic on the so-called other side? You're saying that the U.S. government is in cahoots with banks and other abusive elements, and that it hates you and wants to destroy you, and you want to give it censorship powers. You're not arguing against censorship. You're just sitting there holding your swastika rally or whatever. Does that seem like a good idea to you in retrospect at this point? I would think not. What I would argue for is that the American people should simply reject authoritarianism in all of its forms. Yes, that means rejecting when the identitarians say, oh, we're going to abuse this group of people or deport that group of people or bash the communists or something. No, I reject that. No, go ahead and say that if you want, and your right to free speech I consider to be of the utmost importance. But once you start actually bringing out the ball bats, it's a different story. If you're on the far left, you're like a communist or something like that. Same thing goes. You go ahead and ramble about the bourgeois all day, and it's fine. Once you start attempting to take steps, physical steps, and some of this is in the online world, it's still very much a physical impact that's had, to delegitimize people to the point at which you're trying to destroy their lives, that's action. That's not words anymore. It goes beyond that. Don't you think that we're causing... don't these people think they're causing more problems than they're actually solving? And they're not really growing their own movements. They're just being vicious. And you got to realize the average American doesn't fall into either of these camps, including if they're like actually on the right or actually on the left. They wouldn't fall into one of these camps. For the 99% of us who don't, it just makes sense to support free speech. Like, why wouldn't you want these fringe elements to speak freely? Again, you probably consider them both wrong. You probably look at them as fanatics. Well, then, yeah, you wouldn't want to suppress them. Also, I'll tell you another secret. When you do begin to suppress a fanatic group, it becomes more fanatic generally. Because once it's being beat on, the softer elements leaving behind a smaller but much more fanatic core. That's when you get terroristic groups. That's when you get the Weather Underground, or George Lincoln Rockwell's people, or something like that. That's when you get actual violence. You're no longer looking at people shouting angry slogans. You're looking at people shouting angry slogans while throwing Molotov cocktails and building bombs or something like that. It's a dangerous game that this country is playing right now. And the tech firms, the tech world really does need to think twice about its strategy that it's employing against these groups. It's not going to work. When you're attempting to look, if you make words impossible, you make actions inevitable. That's my warning to them. When you're attempting to prevent people, even if they have offensive beliefs, from speaking on various platforms, they then complain about being censored, and they start drawing in outsiders that aren't even part of their ideology, because they begin to expand the umbrella under which they fall. That's what will happen with the far left and the far right. These groups will grow. Or they will compress, they won't grow, they'll actually shrink, and they'll become more fanatic and potentially terroristic in form. That would be my warning. We've seen this before. Why do you think the government, for example, with regards to, let's say, the Branch Davidians at Waco or something, why do you think they went and just massacred everybody? It was butcherous. It was terrible that they did that. Why do you think they chose to do that? They knew that it was going to be slapped on TV. They knew that other groups, other people would use it for ideological purposes. Why did they go in and wipe out the group instead of just marching in and arresting them all or something? They had the capability to do that. It's a total joke that they didn't. You're talking about the CIA, the FBI, the National... Yeah, they had the ability. They had the tanks. They could get close to the compound without being killed or something. They could have just surrounded it and laid siege to it. Why did they choose to march in and burn it to the ground on top of its founder and a bunch of its members, including kids? It's because they understand this concept. They can't simply suppress them. It doesn't work. They'll become more fanatic and then actually become a terroristic group, or they'll actually draw in outside support. You can't. You have to wipe a group out or leave it alone and hope that it declines on its own. That's how you do it. You can't simply apply pressure. When pressure is applied, the group plays the victim card and says we're being abused. There's a reason for that. Abusive elements are trying to stop us. And again, they either turn into their fanatic core, or they begin drawing in other groups. It's the way things work. And so that's what's going to happen in the online realm too. People who are, when the left comes out and says that somebody who refuses to ramble endlessly about how evil Nazis are and how much they hate them must themselves be a Nazi, you actually push them more towards being receptive to that Nazi message. When people on the right say the same thing about some garden variety liberal who doesn't ramble about communism all day, when you say, oh, well, you're a commie, it makes them more receptive to that message because you're pushing them under the umbrella of the other group. And so what you've got now is that people who are not violent, they're not fanatics, they're not on the fringe really at all, are being pushed to the fringes. They're being marginalized because of attempts by the other ideological side, so-called. And it doesn't help that right now, it's especially dangerous right now, and I'll tell you why. We have a weak center in this country. We've seen it in Europe. The center has already collapsed in many places there. It's coming here. It's already beginning to collapse here. It's part of the current paradigm shift. Do we really want to live in a nation where increasingly people are where it looks like Weimar Germany, and more people are taking up either the swastika or the hammer and sickle as opposed to the U.S. flag? Is that what we want in this country? I don't think so. I think it sounds shitty to me. I think it sounds like a really bad idea. I think we've seen what happens when nations go down this route before. Oh, wonderful. At some point, okay, eventually we will either end up in a Nazi reign or a communistic reign. By the way, that means that whoever loses out in those street battles gets killed too. Wonderful. Yeah, the flame of the West burns out and dies for the last time. Bye-bye United States, basically. You've got people on both of these groups that are openly proclaiming their want for balkanization now. Baked Alaska, I think, has done this. Oh, yeah, we'll just balkanize the U.S. or something like that. By the way, that's a Metzger-esque line. That was already said back in the 80s and the 90s. It's nothing new. There's nothing novel about it. It's just that these groups are now under enough ideological stress to begin growing their presence. People on the left are proclaiming the same thing. Oh, yeah, the U.S. is like the Great Satan or something, so, just rip it apart. We'll have like a commie nation or something. You people insane? I think you are. I think it's nuts. I think it's a terrible idea. And I think that those of us who are not part of these groups need to resist the urge, because they're both calling right now, the left and the right. I mean the real left and the real right, those that are far out there. They're both calling on people who are not aligned with one or the other movement to align with them, at least loosely in an ideological sense, under the understanding, oh, well, otherwise you're going to be destroyed too. Hey, those commies want to beat you down, so you should join us identitarians. Or, hey, these Nazis want to break up your shop windows too, so you should become like a socialist or something. That's a recruiting tactic that's now openly on display on both sides. And it's working. It's working because of social stress. combined with moral panic, during a paradigm shift of all things. So things are going to keep getting messier. And everybody else who is not part of these movements has a moral responsibility at this point to speak out against authoritarianism. If we disarm authoritarianism, there can be no Nazi rise, no communist rise. They can't be abused. They don't get abused. They're not abusing one another. Maybe they fight in the street or something. Okay, we got police for a reason. Otherwise, though, there's no abuse, because no abuse is made possible. This is why I consistently argue for a limited government. This is why I argue we've created a monster, and if we don't stop that monster as quickly as possible by putting it back into its constitutional little box, if we don't manage to do that, we are at risk from fringe elements rising up, eventually using that same power structure to abuse everybody. That's what we can look forward to if that happens. And it can happen. Don't think that our country, don't think in terms of too big to fail. There's no such thing. Plenty of other great nations have been ripped apart by similar concepts. We need to argue in full favor of free speech. That also means full favor of the Second Amendment, by the way, because then you can defend yourself against rioting groups of people who might seek to beat you down too, because you're not ideologically with them. To the government, I would say you need to back off. To the tech firms, I would say you need to back off. You need to let the people of the United States handle this issue. Attempting to enforce an end to Nazis or communists will not work. It will give them more ideological weight. When the tech firms come out and attempt to censor those views, they put more stress on them and they give them something to recruit based on. You're giving them more power, essentially, or making them more fanatic. Either way, you're either responsible for violence or violence in the future when you do this. It's an extremely dangerous game that groups like Google or Twitter are playing right now. GoDaddy now has launched itself into it. That's a little bit of a different issue. TOS was clearly broken as opposed to, oh, they were just being offensive. But what next? Now, are we going to start going after people even on independent sites for being merely offensive? Would be my question. It could happen. It would rip the internet apart, certainly. People don't even, I think, realize how bad things really are right now. I think they're a little bit too optimistic. I'm optimistic long-term with regards to the social panic that we're under. And when that deflates, it may cause things to go back to normal. But until then, we have a problem, and we need to address it. And the way to do that is to support freedom. The way to do that is to reject sort of the fear-mongering you see. You've got communists right now telling you, oh, well, if you don't join us, these Nazis will go apeshit. They'll start killing everybody. Some Nazis are telling you, oh, well, if you don't stand with us, we'll become a communist nation and you'll be in a gulag, basically. In both cases, it's fear-mongering. It's hijacking your survival mechanism on a mental level. I'm sure there'll be people, especially people on the right, who watch this and they don't like it because they're like, oh, you're comparing us to communists. No, I'm comparing the stratagems and the basis of the movement with that. Again, you consider yourself inarguably correct in your assumptions about the state of the world. So does the communist. So does the socialist. You're all making the same assumption. You're all making similar arguments from supposedly diametrically opposed sides. Although you're not. It's an illusion. You're both seeing abuse. Where does abuse come from? It comes from government and big media and corporatism and all the things wrapped up with an interventionist style of government. We don't have a centrally planned government in the United States, nor do we have a free market, a true capitalistic system. We have an interventionist system. That means the government is in direct cahoots with large corporations and the banking monetary apparatus. Those are the sources of abuse in this country. But if you defang the ability for abuse to be meted out, you don't have a problem with any of these things. I've had people, well-meaning but delusional, argue, well, we need more abuse because we need to suppress one group or another. That's exactly the wrong thing to do. It's been tried so many times throughout human history. Has it ever worked? Has it ever led to anything other than the nation destabilizes and falls into chaos of one form or another? Well, I don't want that. No, I have to live in this country. I don't want it to fall into chaos. As far as these groups marching around saying what they want to say, let them do it. Give them a free-for-all to air their grievances. As long as they're talking, they're probably not shooting. That's the warning I would issue to these tech firms. You need to back off of the situation and stop trying to play moral police. If you knew how, if you had hire some historians to work with you and help guide your policy on these issues. Because they'll be able to tell you exactly what I'm telling you now. That it's the most dangerous game you're playing. You are endangering the very fabric of the Western world, and you need to cut it out. And to the media, media's even worse. You're the ones stoking bad race relations in this country. You are the primary party responsible for everything that's currently going on. For Charlottesville, for Ferguson, for everything else under the sun. You ought to be ashamed of yourselves. You ought to fire yourselves and stop existing altogether. We don't need your kind of scum in this country anymore. We've got an internet now. We've got the ability to disseminate our own information. We don't need a corporate media. And so I would put out the call again to people, cut the cable. Cut off the newspapers. Stop listening to them. If you have to get a newspaper, use it for betting for your bird or wipe your ass with it. That's about all it's worth. For you or your bird to shit on. That's what it's worth, honestly. The corporate, the cable media, turn it off. Cancel your subscription to all of these services. Don't stream them online either. Go hog wild criticizing them all you want. Don't refer to any of their articles unless they're archived. That's the way forward. We should be all attempting to deplatform the corporate media. Who is it not abusive towards? Are they not abusive towards the left? Yeah, they are. Towards the right? Yeah, they are. Certainly towards anyone who believes in freedom. They're abusive towards every race, every creed. They abuse everybody. They abuse people with more money, people with less money. Why do we keep these scumbuckets around? It's pointless. All they do is lie all day and make clickbait. Screw them. That's about all. Peace out.